The alien princess rushed to the engineer, and the whole throne room fell silent. Part 1. The summit of 1,000 suns, the conclave of sovereign worlds, met once every 30 years, and it had never, not once in 400 years of interstellar diplomacy, included a human, until now. Chief Engineer Marcus Idris Okoro stood at the entrance of the Grand Throne Hall of Velithar Prime and tried very hard not to look like a man who had dressed in the dark. He hadn't. He'd spent 45 minutes on his uniform. But the hall was half a kilometer long, lined with crystalline pillars that refracted the planet's twin suns into cascading prisms of violet and gold, and every single being inside it was either royalty, a military commander, or a god equivalent of their species. Marcus was none of those things. He was a 38-year-old mechanical and systems engineer from Lagos, Nigeria, Earth, currently attached to the UES Peregrine as Chief of Structural Operations. His rank was Commander. His specialty was keeping large things from falling apart under impossible conditions. He had a scar on his left hand from a plasma coupler accident and a habit of chewing on a stylus when he was thinking. He was also, according to the diplomatic manifest, listed under his vessel's delegation as technical attaché. Ambassador Yuan Wei had placed him there. In case something breaks, she'd said cheerfully. 3 days ago, Marcus had stared at her. At a royal summit. Especially at a royal summit, she'd replied, and smiled in that way that meant she knew something he didn't. He thought about that now as he took his place at the far edge of the human delegation's section, a modest cluster of 12 people dwarfed by the enormous contingents of the Velatharan hosts, the 6-limbed Krath warrior clans, the luminescent Aethori philosopher kings, and a dozen other civilizations Marcus had only read about in briefing documents. The Velatharan throne hall had been constructed, according to those briefings, 4,000 years ago by the Third Empress, who had wanted a space where all peoples of worth might stand and feel small. It worked magnificently. The ceiling soared 300 meters overhead, carved from a single piece of bioluminescent stone that pulsed with a slow, breathing light. The floor was inlaid with a star map of the known galaxy, 1 trillion species reduced to glittering points of light, and Marcus was standing, he realized with a jolt, directly on top of where Earth would be. He looked down at his feet, Earth, a dot of pale blue light under his boot. No pressure, he thought. The hall filled over the next 2 hours. Marcus stood, watched, and cataloged everything the way engineers do, not for beauty, but for structure. How the pillars bore load. How the ventilation moved warm air through a space designed to hold 10,000 beings of varying atmospheric needs. How the translation field emitters were embedded into the floor at 5-meter intervals, invisible but precisely spaced, providing real-time linguistic conversion to every delegation's simultaneously. He was examining the nearest emitter with quiet professional admiration when the horns sounded. The Velatharan imperial family entered from the northern archway, and the entire hall did what throne room halls are designed to make you do. It made you feel the weight of their arrival in your chest. Velatharans were tall. The average stood around 2.5 meters, with 4 arms, 2 primary, 2 secondary, skin that ranged from deep cobalt to pale silver, and eyes that were entirely gold, without visible pupil or white. They moved with a deliberate grace that suggested they had never once hurried in their lives, because hurrying implied that something had not been properly planned. The emperor came first. Valoran IV, ancient and immense, draped in robes that Marcus's briefing had informed him were woven from the carapaces of creatures found only in Velithar's deepest oceans. Behind him came the High Council, and behind them the imperial children. There were 3 of them, 2 princes, older, formal, walking in practiced step, and then, slightly behind them, the Princess Seylara. Marcus had been given a briefing photograph. Briefing photographs, he had learned over years of deep space service, were approximately as accurate as a sketch made from memory in a dark room. They captured shape but never quality. The princess was 23 years old by Velitharian reckoning, which the briefing had helpfully converted to roughly equivalent 26 in human biological terms. She was tall, even by Velitharian standards, perhaps 2.7 meters, with skin the color of polished midnight and the characteristic gold eyes of her bloodline. But where her brothers moved with the measured, rehearsed formality of people who had been trained from birth to project imperial authority, the princess moved like someone who was paying attention to something else entirely. Her gold eyes were moving across the hall. Not the way royalty surveys a room, not the lordly sweep of a person looking for subjects. She was looking at things. Specific things, the translation emitters, the ventilation channels, the weight-bearing pillars, the load distribution patterns in the ceiling. She was doing exactly what Marcus had been doing. He noticed this. He noticed it the way an engineer notices something unexpected. With immediate, sharp interest that bypassed social filters entirely. He found himself tracking her gaze across the room, reverse engineering what she was seeing, building the same mental map she was building. She was smart. Whatever else she was very, very smart. Then the imperial family reached the dais, the horns ceased, and the conclave began, part 2. The problem no one would name. The conclave's first 3 days were what Marcus had expected. Elaborate, exhausting, and largely above his clearance level. He attended sessions, stood where he was told, sat when permitted, and listened to 4 centuries of interstellar diplomacy being conducted in a language he was only beginning to understand. Not linguistically, the translation field handled that seamlessly. But diplomatically, the way every statement was simultaneously a concession and a demand, the way silence was deployed as a weapon, the way every species' representatives had developed, over centuries of interaction, a set of shared fictions they all agreed to maintain because reality was too complicated to deal with directly. On the 4th day, something in the hall broke. It happened at mid-morning during a recess. Marcus was standing near the eastern colonnade, doing what he usually did during recesses. Walking the perimeter, examining load points, looking for stress fractures or settlement cracks in the structure because he couldn't help it, when he heard a low, subsonic hum that shouldn't have been there. He stopped. He tilted his head, the way he always did when he was listening to something structural. The hum had a frequency he recognized, harmonic resonance. Something was vibrating at a frequency that was building on itself, feeding back into its own oscillation. In a space this size, in a structure with this level of crystalline stone in its composition, Marcus's blood went cold. He pulled out his personal scanner, standard equipment, barely larger than a stylus case, something he carried the way other people carry medication, and began taking readings the Eastern Pillar Cluster. Specifically, Pillar E7, which bore a disproportionate share of the ceiling load in this section due to what he had already identified on day 1 as a non-optimal ancient renovation that had redistributed weight unevenly. And beneath E7, embedded in the floor, one of the translation field emitters was malfunctioning. It was emitting a low-frequency pulse at 7 hertz, inaudible to most species in the hall, that had been coupling with the natural resonant frequency of the crystalline pillar above it. The pillar was singing, and if it kept singing, in approximately 6 to 8 hours it would crack. Marcus stood very still for approximately 3 seconds, which was how long it took him to move from identifying the problem to calculating the consequences. The pillar was load-bearing. The ceiling section above it spanned 40 meters. Below that ceiling section during the afternoon session would be the delegation areas of the Aethori, the Krath, and he checked the floor map in his briefing documents, the Imperial Dais. He started moving. The problem, and Marcus understood this with the clarity of someone who had spent his career navigating institutional obstruction, was that you could not simply walk up to the Velitharan Imperial staff and say your ancient throne room is about to kill everyone in it. There were protocols. There were chains of authority. There were 17 different approval layers between a human technical attaché and anyone who had the power to authorize structural intervention in a 4,000-year-old imperial monument. He found Ambassador Yuan Wei. She listened carefully, her face becoming progressively more still as he explained, which meant she was taking it seriously. Ambassador Yuan had a face that went very calm when situations became very bad. "How confident are you?" she asked. "90s," he said. "The readings are clear. I'd want a second instrument to confirm, but the harmonic coupling is textbook. Time? If the emitter stays on, 6 hours. If we increase the hall's atmospheric temperature by more than 2 degrees, which we will, when 10,000 beings come back in for the afternoon session, maybe 4. Yuan was already moving. "I'll try the Velitharan Chamberlain. How long will that take?" She gave him a look that answered the question. Marcus took a breath, thought about what Ambassador Yuan had said 3 days ago, especially at a royal summit, and made a decision. Part 3. The engineer and the princess he found her in the eastern corridor. He hadn't been looking for her specifically. He'd been making his way toward the pillar to at least get closer to the emitter and see if there was anything he could do unilaterally. Even slowing the resonance buildup would buy time when he came around the curve of the colonnade and nearly walked into her. Princess Seylara was crouching on the floor of the corridor, which was remarkable enough. She had her secondary arms braced against the pillar's base and her 2 primary hands pressed flat against the floor. Her gold eyes were closed. She was listening. She heard him stop. Her eyes opened. Gold, entirely gold, fixing on him with an expression he couldn't immediately read. He had 3 seconds before social protocols demanded he bow, apologize, and retreat. He used them differently. "You can feel it," he said. Not a question. A long pause. Long enough that he understood he may have just committed some kind of catastrophic diplomatic offense. Then she said in translated standard, "Since this morning, a vibration. Here and here." She touched the pillar, then the floor. Her voice was lower than he'd expected, and it had a quality like sound heard through deep water. "I went to my father's chamberlain and was told the hall has stood for 4,000 years and required no engineering consultation from a princess." Marcus felt a specific, fierce solidarity ignite in his chest. He held out his scanner. "I've been taking readings since the first recess. It's the emitter beneath this pillar cluster. It's coupling with the resonant frequency of the crystal. The pillar is going into harmonic amplification." She stood, unfolding to her full height, and took the scanner from his hand with a precision that told him she'd handled instruments before. She looked at the readings. Her gold eyes moved across the data with the speed of someone who understood it. 4.7 hertz, she said, matching the crystalline resonance of E7 to within 2%, the renovation of the 3rd expansion. She said it with a kind of weary certainty. "I wrote a paper on the structural inefficiencies of that renovation when I was 17. No one read it." She handed the scanner back. "I am Seylara, and I know where the emitter access panel is, Marxus Okoro, and I have tools." She looked at him for one moment, a look that was an entire conversation compressed into a second, and said, "Then we have approximately one problem between us and a solution. The emitter access was beneath a decorative floor tile 3 meters from the pillar base. Seylara knew exactly which tile she had. She explained as they moved through the increasingly crowded corridor during recess, spent 2 years studying the hall's construction documents as part of what she called her unofficial education. "Unofficial," Marcus repeated, pulling his toolkit from his jacket. "My official education consists of statecraft, diplomacy, Velitharan history, and the appropriate conduct of imperial ceremonies." Her tone was precise and entirely flat. "I studied engineering independently. It was not discouraged because no one paid sufficient attention to discourage it. How much do you know? I hold the equivalent of your master's degree in structural systems and a secondary qualification in field-applied energetic mechanics. Self-taught and self-examined. A pause. No one at this court knows this. It would be considered eccentric at best. Marcus considered this as he found the tile seam and began working the edge. On my ship, he said, we have a saying. The person who actually knows how something works is usually not in the meeting. A sound came from above him. It took him a moment to identify it as a Volitheran laugh. The tile came up. The emitter access housing was below. A cylindrical unit, older than his civilization, but built with the kind of over-engineered solidity that meant components were still readable and modular. Volitheran engineering had a philosophy that Marcus had come to deeply respect. Assume the thing will need to be serviced by someone who wasn't there when it was built, and build accordingly. He dropped into the access space. It was tight for him. For a Volitheran, it would have been impossible. You won't fit, he said, looking up at her. I know. She was crouching at the edge, her gold eyes watching his hands. Tell me what you see. He described it as he worked. She listened and responded the way a good engineer does, not with reassurance, but with information. She knew the emitter's design. She knew which coupling array was most likely to be the source of the frequency drift. She talked him through the diagnostic sequence in the Volitheran access protocol, which his scanner translated imperfectly, but which she described in a way that crossed the gap perfectly. They worked like that for 40 minutes. Like people who had built things together before, the recess was ending. Marcus could hear the sounds of the conclave reconvening, the horns, the shuffling of 10,000 bodies, the rising temperature of the hall that would accelerate his timeline if he didn't finish, the secondary coupling array. Seylara said above him, there should be a manual frequency lock. A physical switch, not electronic, I see it, but it's... He stretched. His arm was 4 centimeters short. I can't reach it. A pause. I can, she said. You won't fit in the access. My secondary arms are longer than my primary. And more flexible. She was already lowering herself to the floor, her primary arms braced above the opening. Her 2 secondary arms, thinner, longer, hinged at additional joints, extended downward into the access space past his shoulder, navigating the cramped interior with a precision that his 2 human arms could not have managed. Her secondary hand found the switch. Lock it to 2.3 hertz, Marcus said. That'll detune from the pillar resonance and push it below the structural coupling threshold. I know, she said, with a patience that was not unkind. He heard the click. The hum stopped. The silence that followed lasted only a second, but it was the specific silence of a problem solved, and both of them knew it. Marcus let out a slow breath. Seylara withdrew her arms and sat back on her heels. For a moment they just existed in the aftermath of averted catastrophe, which has its own particular feeling, a lightness like pressure removed. 4,000 years, Marcus said, and it needed 2 people who weren't invited to fix it. Seylara looked at him. You were listed on the manifest as technical attaché. That's a polite way of saying in case something breaks. And I, she said, am not listed in any technical capacity at all. He climbed out of the access space. He stood, brushed dust from his uniform, and looked at the Princess of Velithar, who was sitting on the floor of the corridor of her own ancestral palace, secondary arms folded neatly, eyes perfectly gold and perfectly calm. For what it's worth, he said. That was excellent work. For what it's worth, she replied, standing, so was yours. Part 4. The throne room falls silent. They entered the hall together. Not planned, not coordinated. Simply both arriving at the same threshold at the same moment because the corridor they'd been working in had one exit and the session had resumed. It was Seylara who went first, because she understood the architecture of the moment, and Marcus did not. She entered the hall at its edge, near the colonnade, and moved toward the imperial dais with the measured pace of someone returning from a recess. Marcus followed a step behind, still tucking his toolkit back into his jacket. Neither of them noticed, at first, that the hall had gone quiet. Then Seylara stopped walking. Marcus nearly walked into her. He looked up. 10,000 beings were watching. Not all of them, but enough. The Velitheran imperial court, the assembled ministers, the court functionaries, the senior diplomatic staff, had pivoted toward the princess and the human, with the specific total attention of people witnessing something they did not have a category for. The emperor himself, on the dais, had turned to look. Marcus did a rapid inventory of the situation. An imperial princess had just walked into the throne hall from a side corridor with a human engineer who had dust on his jacket. He understood, with a clarity that arrived slightly too late to be useful, why this looked strange. He straightened his jacket. He tucked his scanner away. He stood with his feet shoulder-width apart in the way his old structural foreman had once described as looking like you meant to be exactly where you are. Seylara, for her part, walked directly to the imperial dais and addressed her father. She did not whisper. In a hall with a translation field that served 10,000 beings, there was no such thing as a private conversation. Her voice carried, lower than the male Velitherans, slower with the gravity of someone who was used to choosing words precisely. "Father," she said, "during recess, I identified a structural failure developing in the eastern pillar cluster. Pillar E7, harmonic resonance coupling with a malfunctioning translation emitter. The resonance would have reached critical threshold during this afternoon's session under increased thermal load from the assembled delegation. I have corrected the emitter's frequency output with the assistance of Engineer Okoro of the human vessel Peregrine, who independently identified the same fault and had already begun diagnostic procedures." She gestured to Marcus. Not with the casual extension of someone indicating a tool, but with the deliberate, formal arm gesture that Marcus's briefing told him was the Velitheran gesture of acknowledgement between equals. "The hall is safe," she said. "I recommend a full inspection of the remaining emitter units before tomorrow's session." The Emperor Valoran IV sat on his throne, which was not so much a seat as an architectural feature, an enormous carved formation of the same bioluminescent stone as the ceiling, and looked at his daughter. Then he looked at Marcus. Then he looked at the pillar the silence held. It was the Krath delegation that broke it first. They were warrior philosophers, six-limbed and enormous, and their method of expressing approval was a sound like thunder channeled through stone. One of them, the senior commander, Marcus thought, a being the size of a large vehicle, made that sound. It started a chain reaction. The Aethori began to glow brighter, which was their equivalent. The Dothran chirruped. The human delegation, Ambassador Yuan Wei in front, with an expression that was entirely composed and also somehow the most satisfied Marcus had ever seen, began to applaud in the human way. And slowly, like a wave moving through deep water, the sound of 10,000 beings registering the moment moved across the hall. The Emperor raised one primary hand. Silence fell again immediately. Authority was still authority. "Engineer Okoro," said the Emperor of Velithar in a voice that needed no amplification. "Approach." Part 5. The weight of what was said Marcus walked across the floor of the Conclave of Sovereign Worlds, across the star map that spanned a galaxy, and stopped at the appropriate distance from the imperial dais. 15 meters, which the briefing had established as the traditional stopping point for those not of imperial blood. He stood straight. He didn't bow. The briefing was clear on that, too. Humans bowed to no foreign head of state during formal appearances, a hard-won diplomatic point that had taken 30 years to establish, and that Ambassador Yuan had briefed him on with particular emphasis. The Emperor looked at him for a long moment. "You identified a structural failure in my hall," the Emperor said. A failure that my own staff did not report. Your staff was not at fault, Marcus said carefully. The frequency coupling was subtle. It required a scanner and specific knowledge of harmonic resonance in crystalline composites, and you had both. Yes, sir. My daughter also had both. She knew more than I did about the emitter's design. The fix required both of us. The Emperor was quiet. Marcus had been briefed that Velotheran silences were not comfortable pauses. They were instruments, and the Emperor had had 4 centuries of practice wielding them. She has told me before, the Emperor said at last, that this hall had structural inefficiencies from the 3rd expansion. I believed she was indulging a hobby. Marcus did not say what he was thinking. He was a man of considerable professional discipline, but the Emperor seemed to read something in his face anyway, or perhaps in his silence because something shifted in those ancient gold eyes. You disagree with my characterization, the Emperor said. I think, Marcus said, that when someone correctly identifies a structural problem that later nearly causes a catastrophic failure, the word hobby is perhaps not the most accurate description of their competence. The silence that followed was absolute. Seylara, standing at the edge of the dais, went very still. The entire hall seemed to hold its breath. Marcus became aware, with the particular awareness of a man who has stepped on a vibration he cannot walk back from, that he had just said something to an emperor of an interstellar civilization that no one in this room had likely said to him in a very long time. He did not take it back. The Emperor looked at him. Long. Measuring. The way someone looks at a load-bearing element they are reconsidering. Then, slowly, deliberately, Emperor Valoran IV looked at his daughter. How long? He said. Have you been studying engineering? Seylara's answer was quiet. 12 years. Show me your work. Part 6, the hours that followed what happened in the next 3 hours, was not in any diplomatic briefing, and would not be in any future one, because it was the kind of thing that doesn't fit into official documentation. The Emperor did not dismiss the conclave. Instead, he suspended the afternoon session and invited a specific group into the private council chamber adjacent to the throne hall. His 3 children, 4 senior ministers, Ambassador Yuan Wei and Marcus Okoro of the human delegation, and the senior structural engineer of the Velotheran Imperial Infrastructure Corps, a being named Torath Vel, who arrived looking both confused and professionally agitated. Seylara presented her structural analysis of the hall. She had been preparing it, Marcus later learned, for 4 years. Not for this moment, she hadn't known this moment would come. She had prepared it because she was an engineer, and the hall was a structural problem, and she couldn't look at an unsolved problem and not solve it. She presented it on a portable display, in the kind of dense, annotated detail that only makes sense to someone who has spent years in the material. She covered the 3rd expansion renovation's uneven load redistribution, the 17 locations where emitter placement had created potential resonance risks, the 2 pillar clusters she had identified as highest priority, and a proposed remediation schedule that she had estimated could be implemented without disrupting hall use. Torath Vel, the Imperial engineer, was silent for a long time after she finished. The pillar cluster analysis is correct, he said finally, with the specific reluctance of a professional acknowledging a peer. I identified E7 18 months ago and submitted a report. The report was reviewed by the administrative office and deprioritized. The Emperor turned to look at his Minister of Internal Affairs. The minister became very interested in the middle distance. Marcus was watching Seylara. She was watching her father. Her expression was composed in the practiced way of someone who has learned to keep their feelings under administrative control. But her secondary arms, lower, out of most sight lines, were pressed flat against her sides in a tension that he had learned in the past few hours meant she was controlling something strong. He knew what she was controlling. He'd felt it himself. Every time a report he'd filed about Peregrine's aging secondary hull plating had been classified as non-urgent and filed away somewhere to become someone else's emergency. Being right about a problem that no one had listened to is not a comfortable feeling, even when you're eventually proven right. Maybe especially then, Ambassador Yuanwei spoke into the silence. "Your Imperial Majesty," she said, with the careful precision of a diplomat who had spent 30 years earning the right to speak this plainly. "On human vessels, we have a saying. The most dangerous failure is the one everyone was too polite to report." The Emperor looked at her. "We have no exact equivalent," he said, "but we have an understanding." He turned to Seylara. What passed between them in the next 30 seconds was something Marcus could not fully interpret. There were dimensions of Velatharan communication, in posture and in the precise arrangement of all four arms, that the briefing documents described, but that he could not read fluently. But he could read the outcome. When the Emperor spoke again, it was to his Minister of Internal Affairs. "The princess's structural assessment will be forwarded to Engineer Torath Vel's office for implementation review. My daughter will work directly with that office on the remediation program." He paused. "Beginning tomorrow." Seylara did not react visibly, but her secondary arms, very slowly, unclenched. Part 7. The night before the last day, the Conclave's social functions were as elaborate as its formal sessions, and the evening of the fourth day featured a reception in the hall's eastern gallery, a smaller space, still palatial by any standard Marcus was familiar with, where the various delegations mingled with somewhat less formality than the sessions demanded. Marcus was standing with a glass of something the serving staff had identified as compatible with human physiology, and watching the room the way he watched all rooms when a presence arrived beside him. Seylara had changed into something less formal, still magnificent by any standard, but without the ceremonial weight of the conclave regalia. She stood beside him and looked at the room with the same evaluative attention she'd been applying to everything. "The ventilation in this gallery," she said, "is also suboptimal. Third duct from the right is partially occluded," Marcus agreed. "I noticed it when we came in." A pause. "You always do that, you always notice. Don't you?" "Yes. But I thought it was." She paused. "Unusual." "It's not unusual," Marcus said. "It's just not valued in places that have decided who the valuable people are." She turned to look at him. Full gold gaze, direct and assessing. "Why did you say what you said to my father?" she asked. "About the word hobby. You knew it was dangerous." Marcus thought about it honestly, the way he tried to think about all honest questions. "Because you'd already said the dangerous thing," he said. "In front of the whole conclave, you told your father what you'd done and why. You named it plainly. That takes more courage than anything I did in that access panel." He shrugged. After that, it seemed wrong to let the mischaracterization stand. Seylara was quiet for a moment. "On Velathar," she said slowly, "what you did, contradict the Emperor before the conclave, could be interpreted as a significant diplomatic incident. Is it going to be?" She considered. "My father," she said, "has not survived 4 centuries of rule by being unable to distinguish between insolence and accuracy." A pause. "He is not always quick to admit the distinction, but he is capable of it. And today," she said, "he asked to see my work." She looked at her hands, 4 of them, 2 primary, 2 secondary, and on all 4, the slight roughness of someone who works with their hands, despite every expectation that they wouldn't. "No one has asked to see my work before." Marcus was quiet for a moment. Then, "For what it's worth, it was exceptional work. The analysis was rigorous, the documentation was thorough, and the recommended remediation was practical and implementable. Any engineering department in the Interstellar Survey Corps would have been glad to have it." Seylara looked at him. The expression on her face was not an expression that photographs would have captured, and Marcus couldn't have described it precisely. It was something that had been held back a long time, carefully, and was now allowed very slightly forward. "Thank you," she said, not the formal acknowledgement, the real thing. "Thank you for knowing where the access panel was," he replied, the Velithran equivalent of a laugh again. He was learning to recognize it. Part 8. The last day, the final session of the Conclave, convened on the 5th morning with the specific feeling of an ending, a long-held breath being slowly released. Marcus was in his place at the edge of the human delegation, exactly as he had been on the first day. The hall was the same, vast, brilliant, ancient, but it was also, in a way he could precisely identify, different. The emitter beneath E7 was corrected. The pillar was silent. The ceiling was safe. No body, except the people in the council chamber yesterday, knew exactly what had happened. But people at events like this develop a sensitivity to changed atmospheres the way old buildings develop sensitivity to changed loads. Slowly, thoroughly, and in ways that don't show on the surface. Something was different. Everyone felt it. The session proceeded. Diplomatic language wrapped in diplomatic language. Agreements that were not agreements but frameworks for future potential agreements. Marcus listened, and watched, and tried to follow the threads. He was watching Seylara. She was on the imperial dais, in her formal place, 2 steps behind her brothers. She was watching the session with the attention of someone who was no longer simply observing, but was now also calculating her role in what came next. When the session reached its final business, the signatures on the Conclave's joint communiqué, which the briefing had informed, Marcus was largely ceremonial but symbolically enormous. The emperor called for the delegations to approach the central table in order of their status within the conclave's hierarchy. Marcus expected this to proceed exactly as the briefing had outlined. It did not. After the 3rd delegation had signed, the emperor spoke. "Before we continue," he said, and the hall stilled immediately, "there is an amendment to the conclave record." A murmur moved through the assembly. Amendments were rare. "The joint communiqué will include an addendum," the emperor said, "acknowledging the contribution of structural assessment to the safety of this conclave, and committing the host nation of Velithar to the formation of a joint technical working group to review and remediate the hall's infrastructure. This working group will be chaired by Princess Seylara and will include representation from the engineering corps of each member delegation that chooses to contribute." The murmur became something larger. The emperor looked at Ambassador Yuan Wei. "We would request the participation of the human delegation's technical expertise if it can be spared." Ambassador Yuan Wei, who had spent 30 years mastering the art of saying enormous things in ordinary voices, said, "We would be honored to contribute." The emperor looked at Marcus. Not the way he had looked at him yesterday, the measuring look of an authority considering a challenge. This was something different. Something that, in a human face, Marcus might have called acknowledgement. "Engineer Okoro," he said, "this conclave is grateful for your attention to things others overlooked." Marcus inclined his head, not a bow, a recognition which was different. "Gratitude is returned, Your Majesty," he said, "for a hall that was worth the attention." The delegations signed. The conclave concluded. 10,000 beings began the long, elaborate, ceremonially appropriate process of departure. In the corridor near the eastern colonnade, near the pillar that was no longer singing, Marcus found Seylara one last time. She had slipped away from the formal departure procedures in the way that people who know buildings well are able to slip away. Through a side passage, along a maintenance corridor, emerging where she intended to be. She was looking at the pillar. "It will be properly remediated now," Marcus said. "Yes." She touched its base with one secondary hand. 4,000 years it has stood. "It will stand another 4,000, if the work is done correctly. Your work will make sure of it." She turned. "You could have reported the fault through channels. You could have waited for the ambassador to escalate. The outcome might have been the same. Or it might not have been. Why didn't you wait? Marcus looked at the pillar. At the floor beneath it, where the emitter was silent and locked and no longer resonating toward catastrophe. At the star map underfoot, the whole galaxy compressed to light and order. Because an engineer who waits while something is breaking, he said, isn't really an engineer. They're just someone who knows what's wrong. Seylara was quiet for a moment. I think, she said carefully, that is also a philosophy of governance. Probably. You will go back to your ship. Tomorrow, yes. She nodded. The working group will take 6 months to organize. There will be correspondence. Technical documentation to review and exchange. Yes, Marcus agreed. I expect, she said with the Veletherian equivalent of careful deliberateness, that the human delegation's technical representative will want to be someone who already has some familiarity with the hall's systems and the context of the work. Marcus looked at her. That would make practical sense, he said. It would be efficient, extremely. The corner of her expression shifted, a small, precise movement, the Veletherian equivalent of a smile not yet fully given, held in reserve. I will forward the first structural analysis package through official channels. It will be addressed to the technical attaché of the UES Peregrine. I'll make sure to read it carefully. I know, she said. That is why I am sending it to you. Epilogue, what the Hall remembered 6 months later, the first meeting of the Velethar Joint Structural Working Group convened in the Hall's eastern gallery, the one with the partially occluded third duct, which had been corrected 3 months prior as part of the preliminary remediation work, quietly without ceremony, because that was how good engineering was done. There were 7 delegations represented. The Veletherian Imperial Infrastructure Corps, led by engineer Torath Vel, who had come to accept that there were 2 people at this table whose structural instincts he trusted completely. The human contingent, led by Chief Engineer Marcus Okoro, on extended secondment from the UES Peregrine. And 5 other delegations from species who had, over the 6 months since the Conclave, expressed interest in participating in something that had shifted their understanding of what this kind of gathering could produce. Princess Seylara chaired the first meeting with the calm precision of someone who had been preparing for this kind of work her entire adult life without anyone noticing. The agenda was practical. Inspection schedule, documentation standards, resource allocation, timeline. The hall above them breathed with its slow bioluminescent pulse. The star map underfoot held its trillion points of light. The translation field hummed at a frequency that was exactly, precisely correct, tuned by hands that knew what they were doing to serve the 10,000 different ways of being that had gathered here and would gather again in the long work of building something together. At the table, a human engineer and an alien princess reviewed a load-bearing calculation and, without looking up, simultaneously pointed to the same error and then at each other. Neither of them was surprised. That was the thing about engineers who actually knew what they were doing. You didn't need to share a language, or a species, or a century, or a throne room, or a galaxy with someone to recognize the way they thought. You just needed to put them in the same room with the same problem, and stand back, and let what happened happen. The hall had stood for 4,000 years. It would stand for 4,000 more, the ceiling held. The pillars were silent. The work continued.